In Danish, one of the words for paramedic is a Falck rescuer. That's just the term.
Yeah.
And if you go back far enough, it used to be that the same mechanic who would come fix your car could be the paramedic who came and picked you up for a stroke or a heart attack.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. This is the show where we are decarbonizing the healthcare sector, and we do that by sharing tools, tactics and insights with various experts, and also sharing insights from our work in Green Innovation Group. My name is Frederik van Deurs. I'm the CEO in Green Innovation Group, and today I'm quite excited to have with me David in the studio. So welcome to the show, David. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so my name is David Nri. I am Environmental Sustainability Lead at Falck, which is an international healthcare company. I am originally British and have a background in emergency services as a call handler, and then also have a background in climate change.
And I mean, as a Dane, Falck is, as you said earlier, it's a household brand. So, I grew up getting little pieces of candy with Falck logos on, and my parents had Falck books in the book because Falck also did roadside assistance and all of these things that I think for many non-Danes it may not be a household brand. So could you walk us through what does Falck actually do and why is it not a roadside assistant company?
So I think, as you say, though Danes do know us as a brand, they don't necessarily know what we actually do. So for both Danes and non-Danes, we are an international healthcare company. So we run either supporting the public sector or as a supplement to the public sector, healthcare services and a variety of other services like fire services. So if you're getting into an ambulance, whether you're in LA, Copenhagen or Barcelona, you may be getting into a Falck ambulance with Falck employees who are taking you to the hospital. If you're in Scandinavia, you may come visit a Falck physiotherapist or psychologist. And then there's a whole world of other things. Roadside assistance used to be a very big business for us. It's more of a side hustle. We're focused very much on health, but a whole number of different things that we do.
That is really fascinating when you sort of enter it with that mindset. Do you have a declared mission in Falck? Is there a modus operandi that can kind of allow us to understand what would make Falck say this is an assignment for us, this is not an assignment for us?
We definitely do. I think that we, in the last few years, have changed exactly what our focus is. I think historically, anything that could be described as a helper, in Danish, one of the words for paramedic is a Falck rescuer. That's just the term.
Yeah.
And if you go back far enough, it used to be that the same mechanic who would come fix your car could be the paramedic who came and picked you up for a stroke or a heart attack. Nowadays, we are very focused, as I said, in those two areas of either supporting the public sector by winning tenders on providing emergency services or other healthcare services, and then supplementary acts. So the kind of thing that maybe you wouldn't go to the public sector for, whether that's a quick psychologist who's available immediately, or if your work wants to give you access to massage therapists and things like that. So anything that is supporting society through health is where we focus. And we are a private company. A lot of Danes don't realize that we're a private company. They think we're part of the government or that we're a charity. We are a private company. We are owned by 3 different foundations. So while we're a private company, the money does get reinvested into other things that help society.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. It's actually Falck has really great health insurance in the Danish market for corporates. We used to have it ourselves, where looking at it, I've been pondering sort of the preventive efforts that were in there, that you really got access to psychologists, to physiotherapists, to chiropractors, to massage, and there was really no questions asked. It was kind of like, well, this is prevention, if you do that, then we're going to get better payoffs on our health insurance. And that's something that we have seen when we're talking about decarbonizing the healthcare system. We really do see an urgent need to move towards preventive healthcare. Right now,
Absolutely.
around 10% of GDP in Western societies is invested in reactionary healthcare or in the classic hospital sick care system, and only 0.5% of GDP is invested in preventive healthcare, even though the value as a society that we get out of each dollar invested is many folds bigger than when we start moving into sort of being responsive and reactive towards the symptoms of the underlying problems.
And I'll say to that, we are looking at the entire system. So we try to offer both preventative services, actual treatment, and rehabilitation. And so it's a change in our business. Historically, we were pretty much paid for driving trips. When we think both about sustainability and just improving the healthcare system, we need to be focused on prevention. We need to be focused on not doing trips. Something I say quite often is the most sustainable ambulance trip is the one that never happens.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're trying to move, both as a society and for us as a company.
And your CEO is actually one of the most prominent voices preaching about the benefits from a preventive healthcare system and trying to turn the whole thing on its head, which I think, even though Falck is a big company, I feel like he's in a David Goliath style battle.
Absolutely, and I think he's been talking about that since before there was an obvious business case for it. But it's just, this is the right thing to do, and then we can work out the rest later, which we are getting to.
It does make a lot of sense. If David, I know that you're super passionate about decarbonization, and we have talked a lot about that in parallel and also leading up to the show. Can you walk us through the decarbonization case in Falck? What is it like to decarbonize emergency services?
I think it's really difficult, is the first thing to say. Wow. So when you look at something like an ambulance, it's driving a huge amount of mileage. It's very, very difficult. The requirements that there are for an ambulance make it really hard to electrify or decarbonize those trips. They have to drive a huge amount. They can't predict where they're going. If it's a taxi or a bus, you at least can roughly say where it would need to go. Here in Denmark, an ambulance should be able to drive in one trip from one side of Denmark to the other. And while we're a relatively small country, that's still further than any large electric vehicle can do in one go right now. So the cost, the complexity of certifying what qualifies as an ambulance, that's not our decision. That's either Danish or EU or whoever the government is. The certification, the range of requirements that are there. Also, these days, the weight of an ambulance is so significant. They are basically mini hospitals. If you have a full trauma ambulance, and there's many different types of ambulance, but if you have a full trauma ambulance, it will have so much equipment in it. And of course, every little bit of additional weight makes it even harder for us to decarbonize. So that's one huge aspect, but that's just scope one. That's our fleet emissions.
Yeah, so just rolling that back a few steps in the greenhouse gas protocol, the one that we use to decide how much CO2 are we emitting. We have 3 different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 and 2 are everything that's going on inside the business or the organization that you're looking at, including fuel consumption and purchasing of energy for electricity and for heating. And then scope 3 is everything that you buy from external suppliers. And here in this particular case, if we're looking at an ambulance that Falck owns, Falck operates this ambulance, the tricky part of it is that if Falck is operating an ambulance on behalf of, say, the NHS or the Danish regions or a hospital unit in the US, Falck is not in control of what will go into that ambulance. And therefore, by the greenhouse gas protocol, it actually doesn't qualify as scope 1 emissions.
Technically, no. So when we look at those scope 1 direct emissions, we take an operational control model. So that means if we were to, in a typical sense, that would mean you decide what the vehicle is, you decide how it runs, you decide the operational policies around that vehicle. In emergency healthcare, we don't have operational control. The dispatching is typically handled by our customer, so a region or something like that. Exactly as you said, what's in the ambulance, all of those kind of operational processes typically are not decided by us. So technically, those wouldn't be our Scope 1 emissions. But for such a large company that has well over 4,000 vehicles, we felt that it seemed like greenwashing for us to say, oh, those in the very long greenhouse gas protocol, if you really look into the details, it's not really our problem. So we took responsibility. Yeah, like it just didn't feel right. So we made an executive decision a few years ago that we would take responsibility, and that makes it really, really difficult for us because also we don't get to decide if the customer tells us they want a diesel vehicle, then we can only bid in with the diesel vehicle. So we need to do so much more work, not just with our suppliers on building electric ambulances, not just with our own operations on using them, but also with our customers to say, please ask us to be more ambitious. Here are the options. These are the things we can test, but we can only deliver these improvements if you let us, if you ask us to do it.
In sort of a global setting, now you said you have around 4,000 ambulances that are driving around all over the world. In a global setting, how big of an actor is Falck? Is that a small emergency fleet or is that a comparatively large emergency
So
fleet?
we are the largest international emergency services company. So we are the second biggest in the world, but the largest only operates in the US. It's just the US is so large that means they're the largest. So we're the largest that crosses boundaries, crosses borders, and that means when you cross a border, things change quite a lot. Even within the regions in Denmark, the way that you run ambulance services can change. There's clearly a lot of similarities, but once you get to the US, it really completely changes. The nature of the business would be alien to a lot of people who've experienced European emergency services. And all of those little changes, while we can see connections across, and because of our scale, we can apply innovations that we find in one place to another place, we also have to account for the fact the US is fundamentally different, and the way that the business works there operationally and financially is a very different context.
So if thanks for clarifying that. I was just thinking what are we looking at in global terms? So you made that very clear. If we are getting practical on the decarbonization, so what are the key elements that you're addressing in your decarbonization strategy for Falck?
So we are considering Scope 1, 2, and 3. We need to consider the full picture. It's just not sustainable. If any company tells you, or company, country, individual tells you that they're only focused on Scope 1 and 2, then that is not sustainable. When we, a few years ago, set just Scope 1 goals, I said, I can do that for you tomorrow. Subcontract out our services and poof, it's in Scope 3, it's gone. It's no longer our responsibility. So we are considering Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, our full value chain, upstream and downstream. Within that, we then need to pull on a lot of different levers to reach the ambitious goals that we have, which our publicly announced goal is within Scope 1 a 50% reduction. We will be setting just as ambitious goals in Scope 2 and Scope 3. We're going to have to pull a lot of different levers. So we'll have to partly look at the existing ways that we run services and just improving that. I think we have a whole series of innovation levers of different ways that we can approach this issue.
Do you know what are the most material areas for you to address in this?
So our fleet and the operational costs of in CO2 terms of that fleet is vast for us. That would be the second biggest category. And then purchased goods and services is also significant, which I think we see that across all of healthcare. Compared to a hospital, we have less in purchased goods and services. In an ambulance, they simply use less material, and it's still a huge factor for us. So, yeah.
That makes sense. So those are the two.
Those are the two that were far ahead of
tackle.
Everything else, and the rest matters. Every small part matters, but definitely the tailpipe emissions from the fleet and the purchased goods and services.
Cool. That's really interesting to hear. Are you looking into extending the lifetime in the fleet? I suppose that would be one thing where you have a relatively large degree of control. How long an ambulance is on the streets, or is that also?
So actually, we don't have a large degree of control on that. In general, in the countries that we work in, when you get a an ambulance contract, it would be for 5 to 7 years, and they will specify usually that they would like new vehicles at the start of that. So one of the things that when I say we have to talk to our customers about letting us change some things, finding some flexibility, one of the things that we say to them is, if we can roll over older vehicles into your contract, then we can replace with electric vehicles much, much faster. So because the rate of battery technology is changing so quickly, if I had a contract that started tomorrow, the electric vehicle that I could use for it would be significantly worse than the one I could use in 3 years. So if I can say to a customer, let us use this old vehicle for an extra 3 years, then we can introduce a new vehicle that will be so much more capable. But that's a very fundamental change in how tenders work. And there's very good reasons, very, very good reasons why tenders shouldn't be so flexible, because it's, many, many reasons. So that's a change that requires collaboration between the public sector, between the private sector, between all actors to say, if we want to achieve these goals at this speed, we need to find new forms of flexibility, new ways of working together in order to do that.
How about end of life of those vehicles? Do you actually buy them and own them, or do you lease and rent? Or?
Typically lease our vehicles. It does depend on, historically we owned them. Typically these days we lease, and that's the kind of case where the greenhouse gas protocol, it really does make a difference.
Yeah,
even though the vehicles still exist, they're still right there, they're still running, it can make a massive difference whether you lease or buy. So as one specific example of that is, if you need to track, when you sell a vehicle, you should track the rest of its life.
Yes.
Which is obviously essential, because when Mercedes make a vehicle, it's important that they see as part of their scope 3, their downstream emissions, that they see what is the life of the carbon emissions over the life of this vehicle. You also need to, of course, track the end of life. What are the carbon emissions associated with at the end of this vehicle's life? For us, if we were to sell an old vehicle that we've used for as long as we can use it, it would look in our carbon accounting as if we're emitting more than just wasting that vehicle, because we'd need to count the rest of its life and the end of life rather than just the end of life.
Yeah.
Which, it's vaguely annoying for us. It's very important that it's there for the greenhouse gas protocol, because that is how you capture the full picture. And it's inevitable once you get to scope 3 that there is double counting, that there are weird edge cases like that. So I'm glad the protocol's written that way. It's a little odd for our business.
Yeah, of course, and I think there's so many in between strange cases out there that we're going to see as this field matures. I also have a strong feeling that Scope 3 is going to be revised eventually, because as someone says, everyone's Scope 1 is somebody else's Scope 3, or vice versa, and it adds up that there's this strange double accounting methodology to it, that we end up accounting a lot of the CO2 twice. You have told me that you have 4 different levers for innovation that you're applying in this decarbonization setting, and they are existing, smarter, new, and transformational. Those are the 4 levers, and I'd love to dive into them one by one and say the first one, existing. What does it mean, and why is it meaningful?
So, changing an existing way of working means that we're not fundamentally changing anything about the service delivery. So our electric ambulance, which we have an electric ambulance running on the streets of Copenhagen right now, it was quite big news in Denmark. It's only one vehicle, but that's the way these things work, I think.
I bet it's wonderful to bike right behind it.
It's a cool vehicle, but it is just one right now here in Copenhagen. So when we introduce an electric ambulance, we're not actually really changing that much about the service delivery. For you as a patient, you're not seeing any difference. We're still driving from one place to the next, picking up a patient, driving them to the hospital. Cool. So that's an existing way of working. It's significantly better in CO2 terms, but we haven't messed with the system too much.
Yeah. So that's the existing model. We take something, that already exists, we replace it with a new thing that also already exists, is commoditized, is rolled out, the customer will not feel the difference unless they get car sick from driving in EVs or something like that. That's cool. Then that's very clear.
There are, of course, some, just because it's an existing way of working doesn't mean that we don't have to change some things. When it comes to electric ambulances, there are many, many questions around infrastructure, around how we manage those vehicles, the life of those vehicles. But fundamentally, it's the same process.
And if we're looking at the second point, smarter,
what
would be an example of something being done smarter?
So I think there's a lot of overlaps between existing and smarter, but the distinction that we make is if we're changing something more fundamental about how the system works. So that could be, as an example, changing the dispatch system. So the way that ambulance services work, it gets very, very complicated and it varies from country to country. But basically, we try to place an ambulance where we think calls will happen. So we have pretty good predictive models around we think a stroke will happen here or in this part of town in the next, say, 2 hours. And so we place an ambulance where it can respond. All of our contracts, all of our success time is based on response time. So depending on the nature of the call, and there's a lot of different types of calls from A to F, where A would be full trauma, someone is probably going to die if we don't get there ASAP. B would be not immediately life-threatening, but you still want to get there pretty fast. And then C to F, it varies wildly.
Does F mean that you will not need an ambulance?
You will need so all of these are ambulance calls, but once you get down to the C to F, it might be like an intra-hospital, inter-facility transport. So maybe that patient is fine, but they can't just go in a taxi from one hospital to another for whatever reason, because we need to monitor them. It could be something as simple as this patient needs to go home, but because of specific needs, they are not able, again, just to go in a taxi. So we need to take them with monitoring and things like that. So, but there's the C to F, very, very different types of things. When we're talking about the A and B calls, the response time for those calls is essential. It's really, really essential that we get there, for a stroke patient as quickly as possible. So we would plan in the dispatch system, where should this ambulance be so it can get to these calls? And of course, sometimes you can be surprised by something. Someone gets lost on a mountain or something like that. But in most cases, particularly in cities, we can plan that. So a smarter way of working would be considering in our dispatching not just response time, which is essential, and we're never going to sacrifice response time, but also CO2. Can we build the dispatch system in a way that, yes, we can get to that stroke patient within 8 to 10 minutes or sooner, but also we're going to emit less CO2 while we go. And that requires a lot of collaboration, of course, with many, many different actors and discussions around what is most important. I think that's a big question for us in general, and for people who work in the healthcare space, of what is the trade-off between immediate safety and lower emissions. And is there a trade-off? Because in a lot of cases, you shouldn't be trading anything. You should just be focusing on the safety, on getting there. In some cases, maybe we can go slightly slower to some of the B calls or to a C call and get lower emissions, and that would be a net positive.
Wouldn't there also be many cases where, I suppose, if we're looking at a city case, essentially the times you'll have to break the ambulance down in speed would be the main time consumers and probably also the main CO2 consumers. Since if you already have sort of invested your CO2 in the acceleration of the vehicle, keeping and maintaining the speed is comparatively cheap.
Yeah.
So I feel there would quite often be an overlap in what is the least CO2 we can invest in getting from A to B, and what is the least time we can invest. Because essentially you're cutting out those slow acceleration points.
Absolutely. And so in our US vehicles, we sometimes have a little clicker that will change the lights that we're coming up to. I actually am not sure if the same technology happens in Denmark.
It's like the one Dumbledore has in Harry Potter, right?
Yeah, so it will change the lights so that our ambulance can go straight through. Now that's not for CO2 purposes, obviously, but it could be used for, well, if you don't have to slow down so much, then we're not using so much fuel.
It sounds more useful than the one Dumbledore has, actually, when I think about it, because he just takes light, right? Takes it away.
I think it's been too long since I've seen Harry Potter to be confident on this.
He has a lighter that can take in, then he sort of sweeps in the lights one by one. And I'm just thinking, this sounds a little bit similar, but just putting in green lights. And I think I have that need more often in my life.
Probably, yes. I don't think that you're going to get access to one, I'm afraid.
Oh. In a different life, maybe. That's cool, David. Thanks for sharing that sort of this smarter approach. If we're moving on to the third dimension, something new, what would be an example of something new and innovative?
So we have developed healthcare drones and we have a plan to use manned drones, as in with a paramedic sat in the drone. Mm-hmm. That's pretty sci-fi, but at least at this level right now, we have drones that are running around Greenland, that are running around Stockholm, that are going to the Danish islands and transporting samples, transporting medicine to these areas that are quite hard to access.
Yeah, I know one of them is at Ærø, right?
Exactly.
I think it is the place in Denmark with the most sunshine. Which is
sounds,
just a side fact.
Sounds believable. So it used to be that if you needed to transport certain medical samples, blood tests and things like that from there, you would be driving a vehicle. These are very small samples. Mm-hmm. It takes a while to get it on a vehicle back to the mainland. If we can send a drone with those samples, then the patients get their results much quicker. It's much, much better for the planet. It's just completely net benefits. And so we've developed these drones. We're using them right now. We're testing lots of different scenarios in which they can help the healthcare system.
One thing that's really fascinating there is, of course, drones are new. Drones are cool. It has that sci-fi element to it that you've, as you also said, like, okay, that's something we didn't grow up with. Or, maybe there was someone like with a remote control for a model airplane or something like that, and it never quite worked. And you were like, we had these remotely controlled cars as kids that they never like really worked unless you were a super nerd and could kind of tinker with it yourself. And I think when I'm looking at drone technology today and I'm looking at preventive healthcare, I'm also thinking that something that could be very sci-fi would be a manned drone that is not manned, but that's able to go out and deliver trauma medicines, with a robot actually.
Yeah.
That could just get there in seconds flat and be able to deliver that injection that would actually make this patient survive, if we're looking at cardiac arrests or similar cases.
And we do already have that. We have defibrillators. I mean, if you walk around Copenhagen, then a lot of them will be Falck defibrillators. Mm-hmm. But if you walk around Copenhagen, you can see defibrillators all over the place. And now there are heart runners, people who get a notification on their phone to say there is a heart attack. Can you run to get this defibrillator and take it? So it absolutely is sci-fi. I think we should also sometimes recognize just how sci-fi we are right now. Mm-hmm. Those defibrillators save lives every single day. And that's lives that would just have been lost not that long ago.
Yeah, that is really mind-boggling. If we dive into the drone case, now we have a remote island. I think that case is fairly clear. We don't need to send a nurse out to take the sample. Go into his or her car and go into the ferry, take off at the island, find the home, take the sample, go back into the car again, into the ferry again, and so on and so forth. So that's a massive CO2 saving, provided the drone is electric, which I assume it is.
They are.
What other drone cases could you envision or have you deployed already?
So one that's not in healthcare, but is related, is in Stockholm. We've just signed a deal for the drones to be tracking traffic patterns and traffic situations so that the traffic authority in Stockholm can have a much better understanding of live patterns and what is happening right now. And if there is a crash, so related to healthcare, but if there is a crash, they can send a drone to assess and work out what exactly should we be doing next. So that's and get there much, much quicker than, say, the ambulance or the fire service to cut someone out of that vehicle or whatever it is.
So what the way it's done today, there's a crash on a Danish highway.
Yeah.
Someone calls in the crash to
Yeah.
the 911 or 112
Yeah.
in Denmark. Is it then go look see? Then it's an ambulance going out there?
Well, it would be it would depend on the crash. There would almost certainly be an ambulance. There would almost certainly be firefighters because they use the so-called jaws of life, these huge machines to cut people out of vehicles. And it would be, I can't remember what the actual name of them is, but the highway patrol people who go out.
Those guys.
To assess the situation, to work out how can we reroute things, how can we solve this.
But it would actually, that situation would only start going into sort of resolving mode once someone is on site.
Yeah.
So being able to fly over and inform both the paramedics going out there, but also the rest of the emergency staff that will clear the road, etc. I suppose that will have huge implications as well. One side of it is, of course, the whole saving lives part of it, but I also imagine that we do actually avoid a lot of CO2 in removing that congestion faster because most of the cars on the street are just,
I actually haven't considered that, but that's probably true, that there would also be CO2 savings in. I mean, then you get into the so-called scope 4 of avoided emissions and how much have you made a difference, which is not fully quantified yet and not full and somewhat controversial, but absolutely there could be emission savings in fixing those congested flows.
That is really cool. And also just considering that they'd be able to save lives with a higher degree of probability by knowing where they're going so they can prepare ahead of time instead of, relying on being physically present. I think this was really clear for the third case, the new. So we've gone over the existing, the smarter, the new. The fourth and last one is the transformational change. Well, what would be an example of transformational innovation?
So that's where we get really sci-fi, even though we are doing it in some places already. But that would be transformation. An example of transformational change would be that right now I have a smartwatch on that tells me what my heart rate is and how I'm doing. And it gave me a notification earlier today to say, congratulations, you're walking more than you do usually on a Thursday. If we can apply that kind of health tech to chronic conditions so that we can spend more time on prevention, that would be massive, not just in CO2 savings. Really, I'd say that's a secondary concern, but in the patient experience and in the cost, in resources to hospitals and the entire health system.
But also for the patients' families, right?
For the patients, it would be so much better.
You told me earlier that most of the emergency rides are actually to go to patients that have chronic illness or chronic diseases.
A huge number of the calls that we go out to are exactly dealing with chronic illnesses. It varies from region to region, country to country, but it's a really, really significant number. And there are a lot of these patients so I've got some stats from Denmark that 1/5 of Danes over the age of 18 have at least one chronic illness, or chronic condition. And if we're going to those lower acuity calls, those calls that really we don't need to be using a paramedic, it's massively, massively wasteful. I think, so in one of our contracts in California, 40% of those calls would be to these kind of patients who don't need a paramedic. They don't need an ambulance response. They need some healthcare, and there's various reasons why they're not getting access to that healthcare, or they've had to call. Maybe they don't know who to go to. Maybe they don't have access to a healthcare system that can help them. There's many, many reasons, But if we can divert those patients, whether it's chronic ones or other reasons that they don't need this kind of response, it would be so much better for the patients. So as one example of that, another stat from Denmark would be, let me just make sure that I'm getting this right, so I'll just need to recall it, but for the patients who are multi-chronic, as in they have more than one chronic condition, so maybe they have COPD, like a lung disease, and they have diabetes. For those multi-chronic patients, they are going to a hospital more than 5 times a month. Because they say they've got one specialist for their heart issue and one specialist for their lung issue. They're going in for separate trips for those. And maybe they also have emergency calls because their lung issue means that they can't breathe right now. If we could prevent those patients, if we could treat them, prevent the need for an emergency response, prevent the need for them to be in hospital, the entire system would benefit. The hospitals, we'd benefit, and most of all, the patients would have a much, much nicer experience. And that kind of
much more dignified as well.
Much more dignified. They wouldn't spend so much of their life on just trying to, keep above water with these chronic diseases or chronic conditions. And we've actually been doing that already in Colombia for the last 15 plus years. So that's, in Colombia, the reason why we do it, or the reason why it started, is the healthcare system is very much insurance-based. And it's much, much cheaper for the insurance companies to not have their customers be in hospital. But we save capacity in the hospitals. So what we do there is we pick them up in the hospital, we take them home, and then we check on them regularly, whether that's depending on the condition. Maybe it's twice a day. Maybe it's more regular than that. Maybe it's less. They are spending weeks less of their life in the hospital, having a much, much nicer experience. And it's saving CO2. It's also saving money, which, whether you're in the public or the private sector, the cost is a huge factor in us being able to deliver healthcare services to more people.
Of course. Yeah, there's limited capacity, and I think for those where the CO2 case here is not entirely clear, a lot of it has to do with what we call length of stay. So each bed day a patient has inside a hospital is associated to a relatively large load of CO2 because the load of keeping the lights on in a hospital is quite high because there are requirements for maintaining a sterile or close to sterile environment. So the HVAC units are just pumping in fresh air all the time and cooling the entire facility to certain temperatures. So it's a really energy intensive place to be compared to any citizen's home, basically. So typically staying in a hospital will be associated with much higher CO2 emissions. And then, of course, any treatment, any consumption of drugs and medical devices will come on top of that. But just to stay in the bed in a hospital is very CO2 intensive. So this is a great case to put up, and I think you're really touching upon something that's basically the main barrier for a transformation towards a preventive healthcare system is that the incentives are not aligned. But in the insurance business, they are actually approaching alignment because you have the insurance company that has to pay out less if the patients are healthier. Yeah. So I think this is actually quite interesting that the way the sort of Danish healthcare system is designed and governed, the incentive structures are quite crystallized. It's going to be really relatively difficult to change that around, whereas in a system like Colombia, where it's private insurance, it's probably going to be comparatively faster to do it like that because the connection to the business case is much tighter in a way, you can say.
I will say there are costs and benefits in both systems. I think
Definitely.
The importance of joined up thinking is huge. So to give an example where it's so much easier for us in Denmark than it is in the US. Blankets in ambulances. We use a huge number of blankets. Every single patient gets 1 or 2 blankets when they come into an ambulance. Now, because in Denmark, the entire hospital system is linked up, they can buy the blankets, We can drop them at the hospital. They can get washed. They can go straight back into the system. They can come back to us. It all makes sense. We can reuse those blankets. In the US, we are dropping patients at private hospitals that may have no connection to each other at all. That means we have single-use blankets because there's no system there to manage that recycling. It is crazy, CO2-wise and cost-wise, to buy a blanket. Now, they do get washed and they get passed to homeless shelters and things like that, but it's still just not the best patient experience. I can tell those... They're not the best blankets if they're single-use blankets.
Oh, for sure.
That's a simple example of where the joined-up thinking that you can do in a country like Denmark makes it so much easier for us to make changes. You're absolutely right that there are times where, as I said earlier, we traditionally get paid for driving patients to the hospital. We are doing innovation that effectively destroys our own business.
Yeah.
And that's because it's the right thing to do. That's because prevention is so, so important. That's where we need to go. But if we can't collaborate with the public sector on, well, if we're saving you money overall, if we're saving money and saving CO2 by reducing the number of patients in the hospitals, how can we link these incentives together?
Yeah, we're actually working right now on a white paper for an insurance company where we are lining up the carbon business case for a value-based healthcare system. And in Denmark, we are working with the term value-based healthcare, so basically paying per unit of health that we get out from the health system. And that is a very innovative approach. It's not adopted wide and far right now. It's mostly an academic concept, but it is applied in a Danish context. So where I think it gets really interesting is that we have been quite deeply invested in having one of the best healthcare systems in the world, and I deeply believe that we have that still in a Danish context. But then when you look at the potential for transformative change, it's actually kind of standing in the way. I think it's debatable whether we'll see another healthcare system transform into preventive healthcare faster. But I do think that the overlapping incentive for having a more insurance-based healthcare system, it does seem that there will be a much shorter way towards preventive, a more holistically viewing preventive system. But of course, if we're looking at the American healthcare system, I think there's very few things I would like to learn from the way things are structured over there.
I used to live in California, working for Falck, and I also, having worked in emergency services in many different countries, starting in the National Health Service back in the UK, I learned a lot from my experience in the US. It's very wild. It's a completely different industry, really. I do think if I compare the difference between the US and Colombia in how we interact, we are so significant in Colombia that we can do the kind of joined up thinking.
Yeah.
That we're such a large player
that's big enough
that we can be the motivators of that joined up thinking, whereas in the US, it's just simply so large and there's so many players.
I just love the way that they are breaking the boundaries of what's possible sustainability-wise in Colombia. Also, they had that mayor that just, I don't remember if it was a man or a woman actually, but this mayor couldn't figure out a way to pay for a subway system. So they figured out, well, if we just reserve one car lane for buses and just flood it with public buses, then we can have a much more efficient transport system at a fraction of the cost compared to digging out an entire subway system. Yeah. So I do think that Colombians have a few instances of quite innovative, quite bright thinking and pragmatic solution-oriented sustainability thinking.
And so I can tell you that in Colombia, with our calls that we're responding to, I think it's 46% of the calls get a telemedicine response.
Wow.
So that's a huge change. And we didn't do that for CO2 reasons. We did that so that we could improve the access for many, many more people. But now they get a video call from a doctor and then a nurse or another healthcare professional. And then if it's necessary, we'll send a car to pick them up. And that's because we control more of the system there, because there's more links for our customers there. We can do all of that. And we want to get up to 60%. We're getting there bit by bit, with the important proviso of you should never go to 100%. There's always a good reason to have.
Yeah, that wasn't the point.
Right? Like there's a point where it's wrong. An example I could give from Denmark of that, not of it being wrong, but of the similar thing is, in one of the regions of Denmark, there are now visitation cars. So send one paramedic in a car to go assess the patient instead of sending the full ambulance for specific calls. So this would be for some of the B calls.
Yeah.
And what has been found there is 25% of those cases still get an ambulance response. We still send a full ambulance and they get transported in. 75% of the time, we don't need to send a full ambulance to pick them up. So I just need to check this, but 43% of the time they take their own transport because they are fine to do so, and they can get to probably a better, rather than just going into A&E or the emergency room, they can get a better response by taking their own transport to the right healthcare. And then the other 32% of the time, we could treat them on site. That's a huge CO2 saving. I can tell, for anyone who's been in an emergency room, that's a huge, just nice, like it's so much nicer for you
not waiting
to
6
be
hours
treated in your home than going in.
Have you watched the movie Bringing Out Your Dead?
I have not.
With Nicolas Cage, where he's an ambulance driver. I think that's a must-watch for you. I think that's it's just really interesting to imagine what emergency services are like in the frame of that car. It's like a completely washed off ambulance driver that's driving around, I think in New York or LA. Has a great soundtrack by Van Morrison. Definitely recommend that as a watch. David, thank you so much for coming in here and sharing your thoughts. We've been going over the 4 levers for innovation, the case for decarbonizing emergency services, why it's difficult considering scope 1, and particularly the level of control that's there. We've introduced the household brand in Denmark, Falck, and the more global healthcare player that is Falck Healthcare. And then we've gone through the 4 levers for innovation, the existing, the smarter, the new, and the transformational. I learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing yourself and your knowledge.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. We had David from Falck Healthcare in the studio talking about decarbonizing emergency services and about the 4 levers for innovation that they're deploying inside Falck. I learned a lot from the conversation, and I hope you did too. Last year, we were amongst the top 5% most shared shows on Spotify, and we're really excited about that, so please do keep on sharing. Also, we are really excited to receive requests for guest speakers or suggestions from you for someone we should invite for the show. We have a few interesting surprises coming up in the coming episodes, so please do keep them coming. If you're not already subscribed to the show, please go in, hit subscribe. It makes it much easier for us to attract new and interesting guests for the show. If we can tell them we have this and that many subscribers, it's something they care about. Last but not least, I just need to say thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging on LinkedIn. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and comments and giving us really valuable feedback. We love doing this show and absolutely enjoy it. So thank you all for listening. Thanks for taking part and thanks for sharing. Cheers.